Good evening and welcome to the West Virginia Archives Library. I'd like to welcome everybody. We've got a little stretch of nice weather here, so here the last few times we've had some pretty nasty weather, but again, welcome to the West Virginia Archives Library. Our upcoming lectures are The Life and Times of Collis P. Huntington by James Casto on April 1st at 6 o'clock right here in the West Virginia Archives Library. Monsters and Mayhem in the Mountain State by Michael Nost. That'll be on April 17th. And I would like to remind everybody that our past lectures are on our YouTube channel. And when you go to youtube.com, you type in West Virginia Archives, and it'll bring up several of the lectures, and it'll bring up our channel, and it'll have lectures and various film clips and other clips there.
I was just going to say, you can also go to the Archives main page, and over on the right-hand side down, there's a link to our YouTube page.
Right, and there's a link to our Facebook page also. We do announce the lectures and upcoming events here at the Archives on our Facebook page, and also in the email blasts and things like that. That web page, to go to our web page, it's westvirginiaculture.org/history. And that'll get you to our web page. Tonight, in observance of Women's History Month, Dianne Anestis will present A Woman's Touch, 18th Century Eastern Woodland Indian Women as Architects of Social Conscious and Gender Balance. Dianne will explore the diverse but equally important roles of women and men for cultural integrity. Her discussion will look at the significant and dynamic roles of 18th century Native women in clanship, governance, and property ownership, as well as the unique position among the Cherokee Indians of the War Woman. Dianne combines her vocation and avocation as an 18th century American Indian living historian by focusing on historical uses of medicinal, edible, and utilitarian plants. This research has given insight into the cultural sharing that existed at the time of indigenous people's contact with Europeans, as well as some of the changes that were brought about by that contact. For more than 25 years, she and her husband Doug Wood, also an Eastern Woodland Indian living historian, have presented history and nature educational programs that emphasize primitive lifeways, living history, and cultural sharing. Please welcome Dianne.
Welcome. It's good to see you all. Is this thing adjusted for me as well? Everything's working well? Excellent. Well, I'm glad to see you're all here and sacrificing some of your vitamin D to be inside instead of outside. Hopefully the sunny attire will help you get some vicariously anyway. And I want to take you back in time. Let's take a trip back in time. Actually, let's take two trips back in time. First trip back in time is, let's mute those cell phones that are plaguing us day and night here in the 21st century. That'll be our first trip back in time. You get a break from them for the next hour or so. But the second trip back in time I'd like for you to take is concerning the first contact period between Europeans and Eastern North American Indians. So we're going to talk about that. During that time period, Amerindian cultures appear to be a bit more gender balanced than were the European cultures. And it's been an ongoing process for over 400 years for women of European influenced cultures to see that pendulum swing back more towards the center. Now, there are inherent difficulties of research when studying other cultures, particularly those that did not leave a written record of their own. And just as some quick examples here, the patriarchal biases of authors, distinguishing between observation and interpretation, the danger of assuming one characteristic cultures are those of affiliate cultures and the others that you see there. So we're going to try to help work through some of those biases that are inherent in the documentation that is available. Now, we have to rely on the records of others, but we can filter them too. and also realize that we have biases of our own. And captivity narratives can be reliable, but they do vary considerably between eyewitness accounts to just flat out fabrications to sell books. Matrilineality seems to have been widespread among Amerindian cultures, while patrilineality was the norm among European cultures during this initial period. In general, women played a noteworthy public role in governance in many Amerindian cultures, while they played almost no public role in the European cultures, unless, of course, you would be queen. While European cultures were strongly patriarchal, Amerindian cultures appeared to be more gender balanced, with elements of both patriarchy and matriarchy present. Over time, European influences eroded away Amerindian female power, reflected in economic and political influence. There was a shift in gender-balanced cultures towards patriarchy over time. Now, some cultures changed more rapidly than others, and some with greater upheaval than others. And you can see here by the slide, those that were matriarchal and those that tended more towards patrilineal and matrilineal, not to be confused with matriarchal and patriarchal, getting ahead of myself there, and why contact with Europeans would be received differently by Amerindian cultures who have different pasts than the patriarchal. Now, domestic roles are in every society, but European women were expected to stay within that realm, which has been viewed as subordinate roles by the Europeans' point of view. But this view was met with incredulity by the Indian men and women alike. Atakukula, Little Carpenter, when he was speaking with the Governor's Council in South Carolina, he asked, why were there no women in attendance? And his actual quote was, white men, as well as the red, were born of women. And we know that through Henry Timberlake. So the gender balance was in place there. And Indian societies seem to have the teamwork system figured out, but often European observers didn't even understand it. So I have here some modern cartoons to indicate that teamwork is necessary. Both the male and female roles, they do need not be identical to have equal value. And then there's sort of the Freudian cartoon there, so you can sort of tell where we're going with the idea that jobs do not need to be identical to have identical value in a gender-balanced society. Though this is in conflict with what Western society has taught us to think of those genders and their associated roles as opposites. So the gender realms of 18th century American men and women were not perceived opposite in the sense that they oppose one another, but rather the gender realms would be complementary and work together as a whole with equal value. Gender roles were supportive of each other, and genders respected each other's roles. However, remember those research biases? Well, this is what many Europeans saw. They saw the women as slaves and beasts of burden. Well, the Reverend David Zeisberger said that these Ohio Valley women could easily carry 100 pounds on their forehead with a tongue line, as what you see demonstrated there. That's not 100 pounds, of course, but the principle is the same. And Henry Timberlake also recorded that the ancient mother of Osanako, who was at the time a 60-year-old Cherokee warrior and the youngest of 4 children, but Osanako's mother could carry 200 pounds by tongue line for 2 miles. Is that an exaggeration? Well, we don't really have any way of knowing, but impressive nonetheless. So indeed, when men and women were traveling together, the women typically bore the greater burdens than the men did, as Cadwallader Colden pointed out. And he said, quote, the women likewise cut all their firewood and bring it home on their backs, and in the marches bear their burdens. However, what some Europeans saw were the men as vain and lazy louts. So many European observers saw them as incurably idle, largely because they encountered them at home when they were recouping their energies after an exhausting hunt, or during the summer when the men's tasks were the lightest. But the hunting, fishing, and warring cannot be reduced to mere sport, as what the Europeans like to term the hunting or the chase. merely because they were the pastime of English gentlemen. And James Axtell is quite firm on that several times throughout his book. But in reality, gender balance is at work, and the various duties for survival and community benefit are being carried out by each gender. Another sample there of bearing the burdens. Men trapping and fishing. This slide is of beaver stones. Those are the scent glands of the beaver. Very important for trapping other beavers as far as drawing in scent, but even relevant in modern culture today, because those of you ladies that have a passion for Chanel No. 5, that's what's in it. That's why Chanel No. 5 is different and a much headier perfume than many others, and so pricey, because they actually still use the scent glands of the beaver. But anyway, I'm getting off track there because we're also talking about those men's roles, providing fish and shellfish, and also mentoring the children, whether those by blood or by adoption. But probably the headiest role that the men had, of course, was to enter the realm of the warrior, to do the deeds that had to be done, and then return to the world of men. So while fighting was usually physically executed by the men, the realm of warfare was, of course, balanced by female support. In 1761, William Fife, he was a plantation owner from Charleston, South Carolina, wrote to his brother, quote, "War is the Cherokees' principal study, and their greatest ambition is to distinguish themselves by military actions. Even the old men, who are past the trade themselves, use every method to stir up a martial ardor in the youth. The women, as among the whites, know how to persuade, by praise or ridicule, the young men to do what they please, employ their art to make them warlike." Also, in a 1736 French document concerned with warriors and their armorial bearings, in other words, their clan totems, they reveal, quote, "All the northern nations have this in common, that a man who goes to war denotes himself as much by the clan totemic being or symbol of his wife's clan as that of his own, and never marries a woman who carries a similar device to his." So what does that mean? It means that in a matrilineal nation, if necessary, a warrior is obligated to take up arms for his and his mother's clan, for his wife's and his children's clan, as well as for his nation. So heavy responsibilities indeed, and that's what they would be recouping from when the European men were branding them as lazy lads. So it's something to take into account for the bigger picture. Now also the domestic duties seen by the 18th century women were, I thought I accidentally changed that, were perceived by the women themselves as more like their fair share. And Reverend Heckewelder indicated that in a couple of places, and also in the Jesuit Relations, which were available in 1710. So going back quite far, from the Jesuit Relations, they said that it's true that the savages are very patient, but the order which they maintain their occupations aids them in preserving peace in their households. The women know what they are to do, and the men also, and one never meddles with the work of the other. Men go hunting and kill the animals, and the women go after them, skin them, and clean the hides. They are very much attached to each other and agree admirably. You never see any disputes, quarrels, enmities, or reproaches among them. Men leave the arrangement of the household to the women without interfering with them. So it sounds a bit idyllic, of course, but just another tool in the toolbox to see both sides of the picture. Because this is before those same do-gooders, those missionaries, arrived in large numbers. And then what happens? For the first few decades after the arrival of the French missionaries, like their Protestant counterparts in the English colonies, they sought to civilize the natives by turning their semi-nomadic hunting life into sedentary farming, which was tantamount to destroying the economic and domestic relations between the sexes that had evolved over centuries. So while the missionaries' goal was to discourage the men from hunting in favor of working in the fields, that placed the men directly into the traditional realm of women. So it's a cultural upheaval, at the very least. Reverend Heckewelder, he recorded that the men are working together to make chores lighter, to go out into the fields and plant not just an individual family's field, but then move from that family's field to the next family's field and to the next family's field. Sort of like what we would think of as the European barn raising, everybody contributing in that way. But the perks that I refer to on this slide is that unlike their European sisters, Indian women owned property, had voice in council, and had leadership roles in their communities. So some examples of the trade economy and how important that was to the women's activities in their nation. There are several fairly famous female Indian traders that you may have heard of. Madame Montour, she was a French Iroquois métis who was said to have a commanding presence during the trade negotiations of the 1720s and the 1740s. And then Madame Montour's niece, French Margaret, she drove a pack of horses bearing furs to colonial markets. So she was having direct contact with those European markets. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of women being active in that trade economy and not just relying on their husbands to take care of it for them was in 1797. Edward Price was a storekeeper in Creek territory. And he wrote, "We have been much perplexed with the small trade for groundnuts, chestnuts, etc., and thought it right to accommodate the poor women for their little matters of consequence to them, but not of any material amount." So in other words, they wanted a kettle, they wanted a knife, they needed a tomahawk, and were trading on their own right. It started out pretty small. But the following year, that material amount of nut oil rose to 8 gallons, and then to 30 gallons the year after that. So by 1800, when Indian agent Hawkins raised the price of hickory nut oil from 75 cents a quart to $1, the women brought in 300 gallons. So that would be ample evidence that they were anxious to enter the market economy and were responding to incentives. So when you put that in perspective of the hunting economy, those Creek women earned $1,200 from their trade in that hickory nut oil, and that would have been the equivalent value of 1,600 deerskins. And of course, by 1800, 1,600 deerskins would have been extremely hard to get because of the prior trade in deerskins, making deer quite scarce. So community decision-making and negotiation was generally performed by councils, and of which there were many types that interacted with one another on various levels. So there were men's councils, women's councils, general councils, war councils, peace councils, on and on. But there were two major types of wars engaged in by 18th century Eastern Woodland Indians: the national wars and la petite guerre, or the little war as the French called it. Those little wars were the more common of the two forms of warfare. And this type of war has been described as the war for blood vengeance, or the mourning war. Mourning as in cry, not daylight mourning. So it would be primarily the members of a particular clan or a particular association of clans who had lost clan members and were demanding vengeance. And when clan membership was by matrilineal inheritance, of course the female relationships would drive these wars. So Cadwallader Colden reported that Iroquois clan matrons chose men to be candidates for replacing deceased or retired war council members. So while in this particular clan the women were not speaking in councils personally, they were making the referrals. So the war councils could reject the candidates, but this merely returned the decision back to the matrons for further consideration. So, and there are also examples of women requesting headmen to avenge the death of loved ones. So James Letort, that would be the trader that Lee Tart, West Virginia, is named for, he was reporting to the Pennsylvania Governor Patrick Gordon in 1728, and he mentioned something told to him by Madame Montour. And she said that a Delaware Indian whose son had been killed by the Shawnees had brought a long belt of black wampum of 12 rows, desiring by means thereof that her tears might be wiped away. So from this you can infer that she was actually addressing council and actively hoping that this mourning war would be actuated because she had indeed a big heart that needed to be comforted. So there are different councils on different levels, as you can see. Now, the role that most people were familiar with as far as the Native women would be that their agricultural role, planting and tending the fields that the men prepared. So again, gender balance is still at work because the men have done the heavy labor of tilling the fields, and then the women are going to use their gift of nurture in order to plant and tend the crops. So C.C. Trowbridge, he was getting a grasp on the different roles and how they worked in combination, because he said, quote, "Pioneer society had no official equivalent to the female peace and war chiefs of the Shawnee. Those posts were customarily, though not always, held by the mother, sister, or another close relative of the corresponding headman. The female peace or village chief oversaw the everyday activities of women. She scheduled the planting and arranged the feasts that coincided with various seasonal rituals. She was also responsible for conveying the consensus of village women to the male war chief. When the wishes of women opposed those of a male war chief, the female chief seldom failed to dissuade him." So those were Trowbridge's words. So the power of persuasion, again, was alive and well then as well. But what missionaries did was they confounded the female realm of agriculture by pressuring the Indian men to give up the hunt and war and to work in the fields. So horticultural activities that were been seen as female prerogatives, since the women's roles mirrored the biologic gift of nature, were balanced by those men's roles that we talked about. The men also constructed the garden tools. So traditionally, it was the women who owned the crops, the maple sugaring areas, and the nut gathering places. Axtell tells us that in all but the most northern tribes, the Eastern Indians were able to make their living by a seasonal combination of hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild food, and the cultivation of domesticated crops. The men were primarily responsible for providing the fish and meat, while the women's primary responsibility was provided through cultivation of vegetables, gathering of wild berries and fruits, and nuts. So these roles are complementary for survival. So the men's have been on the hunt. The women are going to retrieve and process and distribute the food to those that needed it, and the hides, of course, needed to be prepared for the trade because that represented wealth. You have the food that is going to be shared throughout the clan, and again, the importance of those skins for trade. But sometimes what you hear about, or despairingly, is about the fates of captives through European eyes, because here are Europeans, Frenchmen, French women, and particularly children, who are taken under the confounds of war. So, this is, of course, is a very traumatic situation. However, it doesn't always end unhappily, because we have a very prominent figure, Mary Jemison. She became highly respected and owned large tracts of land, and while she was captured when she was 15 years old, and the rest of her adult family killed, she lived to a ripe old age and became fully acculturated with the Seneca, marrying and having, I believe it's 6 children. Yeah, 6 children. So she gives us this information that tells us that she adjusted to her new life quite readily. Quote, "Our labor was not severe, and that of one year was exactly similar in almost every respect to that of the others, without that endless variety was to be observed in the common labor of the white people. Notwithstanding that the Indian women have all the fuel and bread to procure, and the cooking to perform, their task is probably not harder than that of white women, who have those articles provided for them. And their cares are certainly not half as numerous nor as great. In the summer season, we planted, tended, and harvested our corn, and generally had all of our children with us, but no master to oversee or drive us, so we could work as leisurely as we pleased." So this does not sound like someone who was discontent in her captivity. she actually went on to say how her first husband was killed, and she was saying how kindly he treated her, and even though she had pangs of missing her family, this was early on in her adoption, that he was so kindly toward her that she could not help but love him. So it doesn't always turn out badly. But let's continue with Mary Jemison, because so often the European perspective is that of the squaw drudge, the woman who has to bear all the burdens and do all the domestic duties. Well, quite frankly, as Mary Jemison herself just told us, that those duties weren't that insurmountable, and she was old enough when she was captured at 15 to understand them quite well from the European perspective. So she goes on to say, our cooking consisted in pounding corn into samp or hominy, boiling the hominy, and making now and then a cake and baking it in the ashes, and in boiling or roasting our venison. As our cooking and eating utensils consisted of a hominy block and pestle, a small kettle, a knife or two, and a few vessels of bark or wood, it required but little time to keep them in order for use. But something that may or may not surprise you, because this is not a readily available information, was that in the 18th century, and a little bit past that time, there was that unique position among the Cherokee of the war woman. So while there is sparse evidence that the war woman spoke in councils initially, before going to war, there is some evidence that among certain Native nations, the advices of certain prominent women regarding war were taken from the general councils and the women's councils right to the war councils. So in addition, DeBrom and Timberlake, they tell us more about the war woman. This is an extremely intriguing position. And you have their own words for you there as far as describing the influence that the war woman would have. So I think the reason that they specify that the Ganger troop take only one woman to war with them is he's contrasting that to the army and the pack train and all the followers that would come, the laundresses and the cooks and the ladies that were just kind of hanging on and with different functions. So only one war woman with them. And that meant that she had to travel 50 miles a day on foot, as the warriors did. But less likely than being a combatant, she was more responsible for the domestic duties, for getting the water, gathering the firewood if they would have a fire, not that likely under war conditions, repairing the moccasins. So domestic type duties, but her most important role was the care of the prisoners, because of course prisoners were by far, they would be the most valuable prize of war. So benefits to the war woman, well, you know, she earned them. She was a leader in social conscience. She helped provide that gender balance, because, let me go back to this one. I'm sorry, there's somewhere on there, oh, the way there is. With the wave of a swan's wing, she can deliver a wretch condemned by the council already tied to the stake. So she is providing that balance to the hot-headed warriors who got this captive and wants vengeance to be done immediately, with the needs of the village to say, well, this person is going to be a benefit in the more long run. So that helps really make that gender balance quite evident through the position of the war woman. Now, there have been a few war women that we can actually name and point to in some ways. However, if you type up on the internet, and Nancy Ward, who was a Cherokee beloved woman, she was sent by Cherokee chiefs in 1781 to American military personnel to make peace. So, at first glance, we think we know possibly what Nancy Ward looked like. However, if you do some further digging to more of Caitlin's work, George Caitlin's work, you pretty much find that he had a template, and it's pretty unlikely that Nancy Ward looked like this, but her influences indeed were significant. So I'm thinking, this is my spin on it, if Nancy Ward had a modern agent, She would look more like this. However, this statue is probably just as good a representation as others because the beloved woman is what the war woman was referred to later in life, and because she was holding that position for life. So other women with presence in councils, Manakatutha's wife in the late 1750s, she was actually at the treaty negotiations with Virginia authorities. There was Queen Aliquippa, the town of Aliquippa east of Pittsburgh. She was very vocal in her encouragement of British engagement in the Ohio Valley. In fact, there's an indication that she was quite put out when General George Washington passed her by without stopping at her town to give appropriate social graces. So, you know, she was quite powerful. There are some other Cherokee war women that are a bit later. There's a woman by the name of Maggie Axe, someone by the name of Wild Hemp. I was not able to find a lot about these women, but I'll throw those names out there so that as potential future research. The Thunderbird clan Cherokee living on the Cumberland Plateau, they had two women they considered war women, Corn Blossom and Standing Fern. But as recently as 1995, the principal chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina, her name was Joyce Dugan, she actually received the title of war woman, but I think that was more honorary. It had less the historical basis of women who actually traveled with the war party, perhaps took up arms if their husbands fell, but provided that social conscience and leadership that was necessary to make the nations run. But we're up to more modern day Cherokee, and we talked about Joyce Dugan as a principal chief. Well, of course, Wilma Mankiller, she was considered a war woman or a beloved woman in a different way, because while those titles have changed, the female roles of prominent guidance in government and public welfare officially have not changed at all, and we're well into the 20th century with Wilma Mankiller only recently stepping down and passing away due to ill health. As part of Wilma's healthcare initiative, she attempted to address the more than 250-year-old problem of the devastating effects of alcohol in Cherokee society. So that is an ongoing problem that came about early on. Because we know, let me get the date on this right for you, as far back as the early 1700s, I believe it's like 1755. This is a quote from Edmund Adkins, who was the lead of the Southern Indian Department. He said, quote, "The women voiced their opposition to the consumption of rum, both to limit the wanton behavior of the warriors and to discourage the men from consuming the profits of the deerskin trade." Edmund Adkins went on to say that as soon as the hunting season ends, rum traders would place themselves near the towns in the way of the hunters returning home with their deerskins. And the poor Indians, in a manner fascinated, are unable to resist the bait, and when drunk, are easily cheated. After parting with the fruit of 2 or 3 or 4 months' toil, they find themselves at home without the means of buying the necessary clothing for themselves or their families. The domestic and inward quiet being broke, reflection sours them and disposes them for mischief. So, coupled with the information that the condition of being drunk was likened to the madness or the recklessness that was seen as fearlessness in warriors, and you can see this as being a bad situation, as a bad scenario. And a great concern for the culture as a whole, but the women in particular. But as you go on and you see the traders intercepting these men, these warriors, these hunters, and removing them from the influences of the women, you're getting the breakdown in many ways. You've got the Europeans not speaking with women in councils. We already talked about that. We've got pressures to shift the roles. We talked about that with the agriculture and about those hot-headed young warriors and other social controls that were quite different than what Europeans expected. Now, how is this relevant to modern world? I want you to come out and say, well, why do we care? Well, we should care because that pendulum is still swinging. Europeans brought those patriarchal influences, and while they thought they were doing good, they thought they were civilizing the poor savages here in North America, it definitely had mixed impacts on society. Gender balance was taking a step backwards as far as women are concerned. And then the views of the gender roles became unequal, that the male roles were more important than the supportive female roles, or the female roles were less important than the male roles. So that was something that happened that still has relevance to our modern world. So the decline of the women's influence likely affected the social consciousness, of course, and it tended towards access, but not just in North America, but in Europe as well. I learned that the Salvation Army began in London in 1864. You can see there why it was founded. Alcohol. So European immigrants brought alcohol excesses and lack of gender balance with them to America. So, women are rallying. They're desperate. They rallied with temperance movements to combat that poverty and domestic violence that endangered themselves and their children. This is a time where European women did not have resources of their own, so in an impoverished situation or a violent situation, they had no resources to lead, and they were pretty much stuck. So that's what prompted the temperance movements. So you have that poverty that we talked about. Men spending so much of their time and their energies and their income that they're lying about drunk, and their families are being evicted. They have no food. They have no place to live. And then it goes, hand in hand with the domestic violence. So the problems that came about were that the women's brave efforts towards the temperance movement to get the 18th Amendment passed in 1919, the one that brought about prohibition, unfortunately had less of the desired effect of decreasing consumption of alcohol, but it actually increased crime and allowed mob bosses and speakeasies and general lawlessness to thrive. So that's what contributed to the 14 years later that the 21st Amendment was passed in 1933. So it was an idea born out of desperation that didn't work quite the way they had hoped. But this is a problem that's being recognized in the medical community as well. Dr. Benjamin Rush, you may not have noticed, but he is a founding father. His signature is on the Declaration of Independence, but you don't hear too much about him in modern history. But he was also the Surgeon General, and I hope you haven't been straining to read that because I'm going to help you with that. And his pamphlet that he made, The Consequences of Temperance and Intemperance of Liquors, and you can tell he tries to classify. The stronger it gets, the vices get worse, the diseases get more serious, and consequently the punishment do. So you see this downward spiral of social beings, and it's the women that are being bypassed because they have been put under the more patriarchal influences of our European ancestors, and is a lot less similar to the Indian nations that the Europeans came across than more similar. So, we can pretty much conclude from that is that gender balance is going to make sense. Fortunately for us, the pendulum really is swinging more back towards the center. Women have a choice in their sphere of influence. They have cultural direction outside the family, voice and vote. We can choose domestic life. Certainly nothing wrong with that and very necessary. Reflecting biology, so it's going to be similar regardless of the era, if that's what makes it so relevant to today's society. But we still don't have it all figured out, because right now efforts for equal tend towards same instead of that equal value that we talked about, the bow and the arrow of the cartoon, that these things are going to participate together for the whole. So I think that empowered with this additional information, we have the tools to reassess the Western model that has taught us to think of genders and their associated role as opposites. The gender rounds in the 18th century Indian men and women were supportive of one another, and genders respected each other's roles. So gender roles can be complementary, and we can work together in equal value, with each contributing to the benefit of the whole. And we're closer and closer to that today than we have been for 400 years. However, I think at least one modern person actually understands this situation, so I have to give Henry Kissinger a little bit of credit. Or maybe he doesn't get it. I guess it depends on how you look at it. So, well, excellent. And we've got plenty of time for questions, so I hope I've sparked some interest.
Prior to 400 years ago, this wasn't true.
It was even more true that we could gather because of the cultural, I'm sorry, I should repeat his question, shouldn't I? The question was, I had mentioned 400 years ago as a date that we can be fairly certain because of a European contact in the writings that we have of Europeans observing the Amerindian cultures. And he was asking, was that not true prior to 400 years ago? And I said, well, there's no way for us to know because Indians did not leave a written record. However, this system was in place at contact, so there isn't any reason to believe that that situation didn't exist, you know, even undisturbed, essentially. No, I don't want to say undisturbed, that's not the right word. This situation had evolved to what was observed 400 years ago.
But the new thoughts are that this is not really exactly like you say, because prior, say, 600 years ago, the people who lived here had trade. They had grains, they sold grains, they sold commerce. So until the white man actually came here, the disease and things, they lost what, 60% of the population.
Yes, European diseases were extremely devastating, and yes, there was an extensive trade. Those grains being sold.
You're saying that the women only grew these grains? I thought if you go back here and what the research is showing now, I can't prove this, I just read and see what they're saying. Like you say, the records aren't there. They claim that even 2,000 years ago in this area of the United States, there was more commerce.
Well, indeed, commerce is there, and the
When I say commerce, I'm talking about large amounts of things.
absolutely there is flint, gun flints or flint tools that are available from thousands of miles away. There are shells from the East Coast. So yeah, trade was extensive. But what I was saying was that the women's involvement in that trade was much heavier than what Europeans understood at contact, that it wasn't just a matter of the men were going out and hunting and then they showed back up at the trading post with the hides for trade. There was a whole integral association of the demand for the trade goods, the processing of the wealth, and the distribution of the wealth. So it wasn't that it didn't exist, it's just that the involvement was by both genders. Yes, sir?
Marriage. Did women play an equal role in determining marriage? Who got married and to whom?
Well, particularly with the matrilineal cultures, of course, women had the final say. There was very, very little, I'm going to say, influence negatively about who a girl would marry, unless she was just making a bad choice, and then parents would do what parents do and try to encourage her to make a better choice. However, the pressure is on the male, because if the male is going to have to join his wife's clan, he better please his mother-in-law. Now, conversely, in a patrilineal society, the woman is coming to his mother's place, and then a certain amount of conformity would have to take place, just like you were staying at your mother-in-law's place. But there doesn't seem to be any amount of forcing, that women had a good amount of say as to what sort of participation that they would have in marriage. Yes?
Okay, so they get married, and then when they have babies, is the birth of a female any different from the birth of a male and the way the culture celebrated the event? You know, in stuff like in the Chinese culture.
I didn't find anything like that, you know, because like this gentleman was saying, with disease being so rampant on native cultures, you know, the time shot that we have in the 18th century, where we know that, you know, every child is valuable, and they're actually gathering captives in order to increase their ranks. I don't see anything that says that a female child would be more valuable or less valuable than a male child. However, their raising and their training, of course, is going to be quite different depending on whether they're being raised in matrilineal or patrilineal society. But I don't know about any sort of celebrations. Martha?
You said one war woman would go out with the warriors.
Mm-hmm.
About how large would a warrior party be?
Well, it would kind of vary of your snapshot, because let's take as an example the raiding party that raided Draper's Meadows in 1755. Well, there were only about 15 or 18 Shawnees in that raiding party. However, they went to Draper's Meadows. Let's go down here. This isn't right, but they went to Draper's Meadows. But leaving Shawnee Town, this bunch went to here, this bunch went to here, this bunch went to here. So how big was the cohesive war party to start with? And you'd have to do some real digging in order to put those all together before they split off into their various targets. Yes, sir?
Well, now, when you actually analyze this out, why did they go raid that area that you were talking about? Because a white man had come into that area and killed his approximately 6 months old baby, 3-year-old, and his wife. Jeez. So they were,
It was retribution, absolutely.
You know, but we keep looking the way the Europeans look through the glass, so to speak. Not that you're coming in, the lady said to me, I was up here, another thing, John, that they have here. And I'm part Cherokee, and a lot of people are. And they say, oh, they're savages. Well, I own this property right here. You and a bunch of people come in and take away from it, you think I'm supposed to say, oh, I'm sorry. You know, we were still in the white culture.
It's defense of hearth and home. That's very true. And that played a very prominent part in the recruiting efforts, because, quite frankly, the Shawnee just didn't gather up themselves and decide, look, we're going to travel thousands of miles to whoop up on the white people, because, quite frankly, they've been traveling thousands of miles to whoop up on other native cultures for thousands of years. But you have to throw into the mix the fact that the Shawnees are affiliated with the French. The Cherokees are affiliated with the British. You've got world superpowers at work here, hoping to use the native nations as pawns, but it's not that simple. In fact, history has actually painted the Indian nations as pawns in those great European wars, but really, you know, the Indians had their own agendas as well, and some of them were for retribution, some of them were for to gain captives, to replace dead children, and they were also concerned about the land situation, because without adequate land to hunt on, that's your livelihood. Did anybody else have a question? Well, thank you. Oh, there's a question. Okay.
I'm curious, how did they go about selecting who was going to be a war woman?
Well, that would have been done in women's councils,
Uh-huh.
and it was basically based on leadership ability. And then, like I said, if those women had distinguished themselves, like maybe picking up for their husbands after they fell in battle and exhibit bravery, that's going to be seen just as bravery in men. A very important part of a war woman would also be her fitness, so her ability to to be an all-around community member. You know, perhaps a mother, but if she was younger, perhaps the daughter of a war chief. That would give her access to some of the other situations that would give her opportunities to excel out in the field, whether it be in battle or whether it be taking care of prisoners. So I think all of those things came into play. And I wanted to follow up on something that you said about, well, why did Indians do that? I skipped over this quote because I didn't want you to get bogged down. But this is something that James Axtell has said. This is his comments. He says, even sympathetic authors who have been urged by their consciences or their publishers to expose the injustices suffered by America's oppressed minorities still cast the Indian in its parts as hapless victims who could react to the white juggernaut only defensively with martial courage and pathetic elegance. Never are they given a leading role as determinants of American history, as people who have shaped, both positively and negatively, the historical contours of the multi-ethnic society we've inherited. So again, that just plays into that gender balance, that both men and women have integral roles as determinants as well as participants. So, you know, those examples come from both patrilineal as well as matrilineal Amerindian nations. So that observation goes for both types. So that's a very good question. Yes, ma'am?
This isn't a question so much as it is a comment that supports what you said about Ms. Jemison, which was, I think some of the specifics I missed or forget, but at the end of what we call the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania, the Indian tribes, I believe it was all of them in the area, were to return all their captives to like Fort Pitt, now Pittsburgh. And so all the captives were in fact returned. And then the women who could ran back to the tribes. They escaped back to the tribes when they could, which would support the idea that there was just, even in 1763 or whatever, that there was that gender balance and that it was better to be for a woman there than to be in her white culture.
Well, and
her original.
I believe what you're talking about is the Treaty of Lancaster, and in fact, we actually did a reenactment of that at Wishy Run this past summer, where the captives needed to be brought in. They must be brought in. You've got people like Mary Jemison, who was leaving her 6 children. So yes, she was taken from her white culture, and that was extremely traumatic, and her parents and her siblings were killed. But time had passed, and she had established herself as a Seneca. She owned property. She had all the rights and responsibilities as a Seneca woman. It didn't matter about her birth at that juncture. And to have to go back was, again, traumatic all over again. So when we did this reenactment, we had people who very much felt the part. You know, it wasn't just a matter of boo-hoo wailing. I mean, we're talking real tears and people just bawling because they could feel how traumatic that would be to be torn from your now husband to go back to these people who probably won't treat you that well because you're Indian. You're now a savage. And you know, you're not going to have any property. You're not going to have any say-so. You're not going to have any vote. But that's the least of your worries, because unless your father takes you back in, your prospects for a husband, because of the cultural prejudices, are pretty small. So what do you go back to? So it's all very, very traumatic for all cultures. So yes, you're exactly right in that case. So, and you had another question, right?
Well, you only, I don't know, back. So you only cover back, say, 2,000 years ago. Here, we still trade with the Vikings. I mean, they're finding now that in Michigan, these different places that actually only the things that are written now, that were written for the last 400 years, only covered that little period. You get back in, there's actually more going on than what we know. They had more commerce. They didn't have any problem with the flooding on the Mississippi. Why? Because they actually had big canals going across the United States 500-600 years ago.
Okay, well, I don't dispute that because I can't, it's true. But that information that we have is via archaeological evidence. And to be able to determine whether women's participation, yay or nay, based on archaeological evidence, it is very, very difficult. In fact, 2,000 years isn't very far at all. I participate in a historical group out of Meadowcroft, Pennsylvania, and some of you may know that Meadowcroft and the archaeological findings of Dr. James Anestis pushed human habitation on this continent back to 16,000 years before present. So we're talking really far. And what does James Anestis say? You know those domesticated crops? The women did that. Now, the book that he wrote, help me out, Bill, do you remember what it's called? You don't either? Okay. I started to put you on the spot. But not the one he kind of wrote a little bit about women. The invisible sex, that's what it's called, the invisible sex. And he attributes the agricultural domestication of crops to women because culturally the agriculture would be in the women's zone and that would be their choices of which seeds to save and which ones to nurture. So yeah, he stretched a little bit, but yeah, 2,000 years is nothing. The reason I focused on the 400 is because these guys that could write and provide us with information that they observed in councils or they observed at the trading posts around the 1750s-ish. So that's why I focused on that snapshot. Yes, ma'am?
Do you have a group that does reenactments that you belong to? I've been to several powwows, but I'm interested in going to reenactments or stuff like that, if there's a website or something.
I can give you a website that you could contact because group is the thing that I'm struggling with because we don't really consider ourselves a group. We're pretty much people who have particular interests and particular skills in those snapshots of time, and then when an activity comes up or there's a desire to educate the public, then we have the appropriate attire and the appropriate set of tools to be able to do that in a good manner, then those subsets of people come together. So that's why I hesitated to call us a group. But whether we're at Meadowcroft, where no metal tools, no cloth, we go back that far, or whether we're saying, well, the snapshot is 1750s, you can have certain things, but if you're 1790s, then you can have certain more things. So it's sort of a blurry line depending on your individual focus of expertise. So, but yeah, I can give you a website since you can go to that. That would be wonderful. How's it going? Do we spark any more questions?
Yeah.
We're doing great on time, so go ahead.
This gender balance and the respect for each other's duties and jobs. I'm wondering if, maybe I'm wrong, but I've never, whether it was an old Western or a documentary or any books I've read, I've never heard anything in the Indian culture about what they call a divorce. I think it's because of the respect for each other's duties in the family.
Well, remember when I read that quote about how everybody was really happy and there was no enmity and all that stuff? And I think I said that was pretty much an idealistic, rosy picture that, I can't remember who that was that said that. Because, yes, there was situations of divorce. And they were actually pretty simple. They were actually pretty simple because, first of all, they would be determined before children came along. Once children came along, they were a lot less likely to occur. Okay? And again, women took control, took responsibility in that regard. She knew if her husband was going to be a good provider. She knew how things were going to go. So she was able to take control of that situation. And if a divorce was necessary and was uncomplicated by children, so again, this is sort of like the ideal situation. Remember, you don't have a lot of stuff. Divorce is easy when you don't have a lot of stuff, right? So, you don't have to worry about, well, who's going to get this and who's going to get that. Who owns this stuff in the 18th century Eastern Woodland Indian culture? The women own this stuff. there's smoking paraphernalia. Not very many horses in the time period that we're talking about, and not necessarily owned by the men. We know that Chief Cornstalk's sister, Nohalema, she owned cattle. So, you know, if the livestock fell to her, then no, you can't generally say that even horses would necessarily fall to men, because horses weren't a very efficient mode of transportation. It was mostly by foot and by canoe. So the men owned very little. So when divorce was necessary, all a woman needed to do was put his moccasins and his leggings outside the wigwam. Because that's pretty much all your stuff. So, you know, and you have recourse. You know, if this is matrilineal, you go to your mother-in-law and say, but mother-in-law, she was really unreasonable. And, you know, you have a chance, you have a choice. But yeah, there was divorce in that sense, but it was extremely simple.
They weren't the woman that in
Absolutely not. Not in the time period that we're talking about. Women were very free to be able to make choices that were best for them and best for their clan. So again, that would be something that probably you got through a European source, because I haven't found anything like that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, was Cornstalk's sister a war woman, or did she play that role at Camp Charlie?
You know, Cornstalk's sister, Nohalema, who of course would be Shawnee. So the actual title of war woman or beloved woman was unique among the Cherokee. However, Nohalema owned property. Nohalema spoke in councils. She went to the fort in order to be a liaison between the fort and the military and the Europeans. So in every way she functioned as a war woman, but just not with that Cherokee designation. So in other words, what that tells you, what you can extrapolate from that is that while the name of war woman position was unique among the Cherokee, the women's roles, even in a patrilineal society like the Cherokee, were still there. They were still enjoying that gender balance of the responsibilities of input into the workings of society. So, again, title. Yes, sir.
Do you know where Glen passed it out?
I sure do.
That farm directly across there. One time it was about 400 acres. Shawnees. Still with their family.
Mm-hmm.
They had the divorces. Showed that they had property there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this Kanawha Valley is rich, you know, rich with native influences. But I'm glad that you mentioned George Washington, because there's one other, just really quick thing that I wanted to read to you. But here's an English ditty from 1630. It says, "If barley be wanting to make into malt, we must be content and think it no fault. For we can make liquor to sweeten our lips of pumpkins and parsnips and walnut tree chips." So, you know, it tells you where there's a will, there's a way. And, you know, necessity being the mother of invention and all that stuff. So I think that
He was the biggest bootlegger.
he was an entrepreneur.
He sold in European countries liquor. He exported more than the Kennedys.
George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, most of our founding fathers were very savvy businessmen, and George Washington was particularly fond of land acquisition. So, you know, that's a whole other topic. Let's try to focus on women's participation. Yes, ma'am.
You talk about there are some tribes that were matrilineal, some patrilineal. Do we have an understanding of why certain tribes developed that way? And then you also, in talking, mentioned how even within, say, the Cherokee patrilineal, that women had certain input that I would assume that you're saying that they did not have within European society at that time. So could you just elaborate a little more on that?
Okay, I'll try, and not that I feel like I can have a grasp on all of the inner workings, because as we were talking about before, a lot of these cultural traditions were in place long before that snapshot of time in the 18th century that we're talking about. So to try to answer your question as far as what caused these to evolve, I couldn't really speak to that. That's probably a whole doctoral dissertation. But we have somebody here who can. This is fantastic. Go for it.
Generally, agricultural societies are matrilineal, hunting and gathering societies are patrilineal. You look at the distribution of those tribes, Shawnee and many of those Algonquin tribes practiced some agriculture, but they were mainly hunting and gathering tribes. The agricultural tribes, so like the Illinois and Cherokee and Captivity. This is also prominent in other cultures, Western, Eastern cultures, European cultures. The patrilineal European society comes out of a herding culture. Herding cultures are generally patrilineal. That's why you see patrilineal societies and beliefs.
Oh, excellent. That really puts it in a nutshell for me anyway. I hope it answered your question because, you know, we'd already talked about the nurture, you know, the agricultural basis of nurture for the matrilineal, but I hadn't made that jump for the patrilineal and the hunting gathering because, of course, the matrilineals, women gathered, well, the men hunted as well, but I'm sure you're talking about emphasis. So right. that really helps understand that division. So fantastic, thank you.
And then the other that I was where you made the statement that I think when you were talking about non-human or something about that even within a patrilineal society that there was a certain amount of influence that women had. I'm assuming that they would not have had within European society.
That's correct, right? That's why Little Carpenter, you know, didn't understand when he met with the military and there weren't any women there. It's like, you know, that's why he said, are not white men and red men all born of women? Because whether they tended to be matrilineal or patrilineal, that was a separate issue from the input and the balance that women would provide. So there was that regardless. And that's why even in matriarchal and patriarchal societies, it's more likely to occur if they're matrilineal or patrilineal respectively. But that's not to say that there was not input from both sides. And there was a question back there. Yes, ma'am.
You know, our stereotype, and it may apply more to Western tribes, but the medicine man and the shaman, you don't ever see or hear of a woman having those roles. What roles did women play in healing and religion?
Women actually, and again, what you're saying is true primarily for the Western cultures, that the medicine man and the perception, and the modern perception of that being a male role was more heavily influenced by Western culture. In the East, you know, you've got matrilineal cultures headed up by women whose primary power is nurture. So of course they are healers. In fact, one of the war women that I mentioned to you, and again I apologize because I don't know that much about them, but she was specifically mentioned as a healer. But the reason I didn't give that to you is because it was a little bit later. It was in the later 1800s. I believe it was the woman Kutalala. Her English name was Wild Hemp. She was actually said to be a healer. So, you know, again, women have the gift of nurture. So, and they are primary in agriculture. So, and also in hunting, in the gathering portion of it. So they are going to be aware of plants. They're going to be aware of what medicines can heal and can cure you. So the stereotype of the medicine man is, again, that's just like snowman and mailman. You know, for medicine women out there, there was an apprenticeship. You committed it all to memory. You because you're not able to write this stuff down at this period. And they're going to play a prominent role. And there are actually different levels, sort of levels like we have today. You got this basic Dr. Mom level. You know, Dr. Mom is going to know that you can get salicin, the primary ingredient in aspirin from willow bark. Everybody's going to know that, right? Then you've got that next level, you've got that medicine man or medicine woman. They have actually apprenticed themselves to a healer, to learn and to commit to memory the plants, the seasons, the gathering, the preparation, the ritual, all that goes into the healing. But then, just like we have in our world, you go to the hospital, the guy in the white coat with the stethoscope comes out and he says, "I'm sorry, Martha, there's not a thing we can do." What do? People, now after the second opinion, after the opinions on earth are done, then what happens? People start dropping to their knees and appealing to a higher power. So, commensurate to that would be the shaman that you mentioned. That intermediary between the earthly world and the spiritual world. And again, a specialty, a definite specialty. We have a picture of a conjurer or sorcerer from John White from the 1590s, and he indeed is a male. Now, whether there were females, I don't have any information at that level. But as far as the Dr. Mom level and the medicine man, medicine woman level, yes, women were definitely involved. Yes, sir?
Then we get into the island waters.
That guy behind you. That guy behind you's forgotten more than I know ever known about the mountain builders.
I've heard all this in here, but Denison University comes to North Carolina. That's where the Alkene Mountain is. Most of it's destroyed. And the Alkene Mountain's been studied for years. Found out it's like stop sign, a little V-shaped coating. Have you been there?
Yeah,
Every 18 and a half years, it's around the mound, it's like across the mound, and all the openings. Every 18 and a half years, the moon comes up within degrees.
Well, like in the southern Mississippi tracts, a lot of the sites were laid out according to the sun. But they found out that through astronomical calculations, the Hopewell based everything on lunar cycle. And in many, Indian cultures, time was measured by
Lunar cycle. So yeah, so lunar cycle would be.
Hopewell sites are actually aligned according to lunar alignment.
That is a European term, Hopewell. Some of them not being Indian from there. So that's a European term, Hopewell.
Right.
Okay, well, since this isn't particularly specific to women, I'm going to take another question back there.
You know, you've mentioned a couple of things that the Women's Council would be concerned with. What other duties would they have as opposed to the General Council?
I mean, besides the agricultural aspect, the when to plant, where to plant, where to gather, the proper ceremonies. I know that was all something that was mentioned in the literature about their concerns and their duties. The concern about safety, of course, just in any culture. There was it was tied into the requests for vengeance, as small as mourning wars, as petit guerres, say that we do not feel safe. Depredations have been done upon our families or clans or villages, and that as much as we hate to send warriors into harm's way, this is the only way that we can feel safe. So, those were duties that came out of women's councils. There are probably many others, but I'm not thinking of them right now. But you've given me food for thought. I think I'm going to look into it more so that I can have a better enumeration. Because primarily what the European male recorders that we have focus on either the agriculture aspects or the warring aspects of it. But I'm sure there were others. Yes, ma'am.
Matrilineal and matriarchal, are they basically one and the same?
Okay, I heard matriarchal. What was the first one?
Matrilineal.
Matrilineal?
Are they basically one and the same?
No.
Matrilineal means that
The kinship.
kinship is passed through the woman's line.
Yeah, the kinship's passed through the women's line.
Yeah, matriarchal was just the women rule.
Yeah, the women are more rulers. So think of the classic Italian mother. The classic Italian mother has grown up in a patrilineal society. Take your name through the father, all the things that make it patrilineal. But nobody messes with Mama Rosa, the Italian. So that's kind of the difference, whether you're taking your line through the mother or who's ruling the roost. Now that's not to say that there's not balance that's going on in between there. We've shown that just with this slide. But no, they're not the same. They're not the same at all. But there is some overlap. Any others? Yes, sir.
Don't you see the past 40 years as a resurgence of women's rights? But don't you also see that an almost romantic view of the past, the women in Native American societies, both with their choices, with their ownerships, they have projected another romantic possibility with a corrupt and basically uninteresting future in the capital society we've created. You know, I look back at the women and the tribal realities, both environmentally and socially, and I think you've seen this too. When you go out and educate folks, you're talking about a new, and that means a new viewing of the old view, that societies do not have to destroy the very planet they're on. And in many ways, we're searching for some other answer than the modern capitalist society we've created. Have I been too complicated there? Do you see what I'm referring to?
I think I do, and you can stop me if I'm wrong, because in many ways I think you've hit the nail on the head, that what you're saying is a romantic point of view. I would maybe say a simpler point of view, and by simpler I mean less consumptive. You know, Mary Jemison said it very well. We've got a kettle, we got a spoon, we got some wooden plates. We don't have all that stuff those white people have. They got all that stuff they have to take care of.
Right.
Well, that's just a lot of work. So, you know, that very simply, she's saying her new lifestyle was less consumptive. So I think if you extrapolate that forward and see it romantically or not, as the advantages of being less consumptive and less burdened with lots of stuff, sometimes simplicity has its beauty. But, you know, I'm not a minimalist. You're not a minimalist. How many shirts you own? More than one? Well, you know, in the 18th century, we'd only have one. So, I can't judge.
That's why I was referring to it as a romantic look.
I understand.
Because we're already trapped in the capitalist society we're in, you know. We're already trapped there. But we are searching for something better. And I think women especially see the tribal realities that women, they're learning about those now, and people like yourself are teaching them about those realities. I just simply am stating that 300 years in the vast panoply of time is nothing, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
And what's going to happen in 200 years from now? You see what I'm trying to say? In other words, these cultural influences and political and social realities could devolve back to where we're back in our gardens, you know. We're back, you know, at doing simpler things.
Right, but I think that because we are all modern people, that the only way that we're going to go back to that is to be forced. And it's probably a sad state of affairs, because that forcing is not going to be pretty.
That's,
you know. we
that's
can't-
correct.
Like I said, we're talking about that pendulum swinging back as far as women's input, but nobody can turn back the clock. It just can't happen. But
As
yeah, I
the-
do see your point.
As the destruction of the vast tribes all across the North American continent was a sad and tragic story, you know. I mean, in other words, when you see the millions of people that could have been alive that weren't, because one society was facing another, you know. And in other words, I appreciate your efforts to show the possible simplicities in life, and I think people are grasping that and trying to look for some better and simpler lifestyle.
Well, as I said, evidence shows that it did exist, at least for a snapshot in time, and likely prior to that, we just can't, you know, prove it, but whether it can be extrapolated to the future, you know, and that's probably a personal thing, I would think. Did somebody else? Yes, ma'am.
I know you haven't talked about, but the creation myths of the woodland Indians, are you familiar with them? I'm not at all familiar with them, but are you familiar with them? And do they give any insight into what the culture was that created those creation myths?
Some of them I can see a direct association, particularly, say, like the Cherokee, you know, first man and first woman. The first woman was Selu, and she was made herself appeared. She appeared before man, and the instructions were she had golden hair, and the instructions were to drag her around and to allow the corn to grow, hence the golden tassels. So, you know, in that regard, women sort of play a role in sort of a Cherokee Adam and Eve type thing. But the creation stories that go all the way back to Turtle Island, I'm not really seeing a big gender influence on that, because I'm not the most well versed in that at all. So I hope that kind of maybe gets you in the right direction if you want to look up a few things on your own, because, you know, again, we think that's horrible. That the first man took first woman and drug her around by the hair, and that's where the corn's going to grow. Well, you know, that seems pretty barbaric, but it was just a story. It was just a fact. It's not meant to be literal. It's meant to be the association between this woman and bringing corn, bringing the most important crop and sustenance to life. So that's the focus of it. I'm sorry I'm not that much help in that regard. Well, it looks like we're winding down in questions, and it's almost 7:30. Are you going to wrap this up?
I'd like to thank everybody for attending tonight. It's a very interesting lecture. And thank you, Diane.
Pleasure. I thought my Lenape person said my niche.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to remind everybody of our upcoming lectures, and also on March 28th is our annual hoot-out, and it's an all-night research. The Mining Your History Foundation actually puts that on here in the archives, and we help them along with that. There is a fee associated with that, but it's an all-night research here in the archives. If you're researching your family or researching some other area of history, there's little flyers out if you want to take a look at that. But we do have upcoming lectures, and we thank you for attending tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.